Hello, I'm Dr. Alexandra D., and I'm the Director of Orchestral Studies and Violin and Viola Professor at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Today, I'll be sharing with you some tips and some things to consider if you want to start a string program in your school. I'm going to go ahead and share a presentation with you that we'll go through during the course of this. All right, so I've divided the topics into 4 different basic sections. So we're going to take a look at these. The first thing you want to think about is the scheduling of your program. And this is what kinds of classes you're going to have, when do they occur during the day. So there are a few different options. Sometimes you'll see before or after school extracurricular programs. You might have a curricular class during the school day. You might have pull-out lessons. So that's a situation where you're taking students out of their other classes during the day or out of their lunch periods or study halls and giving them individual or small group lessons. Or you might have some sort of combination of these options. You might have a curricular class and you do pull-out lessons. You might have only pull-out lessons during the day, but then the students come together either before or after school in an orchestra. There are a lot of different possibilities, and all of these things occur in schools across the country. Now, you might get to decide this for yourself. Perhaps you're a band director at a school and you think that there's desire for students to play string instruments, so you decide you want to start an after-school extracurricular option for students. Or you might be hired to start a program that the school district has already decided they want this to be a curricular component. So some of this might be up to you, some of it might not be. But a lot of it might come down to funding, and whichever option you're going with, how it's going to be funded is a big consideration. If you're running an extracurricular program, it's important to figure out if this is going to be funded somehow through your school district or if it will be funded by parents paying some sort of tuition. And if it's that kind of thing, you need to be careful to get all of the approvals through your school district for this kind of activity. If it's a curricular class, obviously you're going to be being paid as the teacher who was hired to do this. But we'll get into other issues of funding for curricular classes a little bit later. If you're doing something that's a combination and you're doing some things during the school day, but then providing extracurricular activities after school as well, you'll want to talk to your principal or other administrators about how the funding for that should work. How are you going to be getting paid for the work that you're doing as the teacher, and how are you going to be providing for supplies? The next thing to consider is what exactly will you be teaching? So what is the content of these classes going to be? What I mean by that is which instruments will be included. Are you going to aim to start with a complete string orchestra setup, so involving violins, violas, cellos, and basses? Are you going to start off with just a single instrument classes? It's not uncommon at the elementary school level to have violin classes. Maybe 4th graders all take violin or have the option of taking violin. There are also middle roads that you could have. You might have an upper strings class and a lower strings class. So that would be violins and violas meeting together, or cellos and basses meeting together. And within a route like that, that could be before or after school separate classes. It could be during the school day, separate classes. But that's one option. Another option could be to only teach one of the upper strings and one of the lower strings, but to start them in the same classroom. So it's not uncommon with younger students to start on violins and cellos only. The reason being that violas and basses are larger. So sometimes when you work with younger students, they haven't grown as much, so it's easier for them to get started and then possibly swap over to the larger instruments later. So that's something to decide as you're determining how you're going to run your classroom. Some of that might be determined by the funding you have available to get started. Violins are less expensive than the larger instruments. So if funding is difficult to come by, you might consider just starting with violins instead of needing to get all of the instruments. Which brings us to our next topic, which is instruments and how you provide those for the students. So in this situation, there are a couple models. There's one in which the parents are providing and one in which the school is providing. And of course, there's some middle ground there as well. Certainly in a lot of situations, even if the school has instruments, the parents might provide instruments for students as well. They might like to have their own. So if your parents are providing instruments for the students, either renting or purchasing, there are some things you want to consider so that you can help those parents. There's a flood in the market of instruments that look like this. All sorts of different colors. Tie-dye that's quite impressive looking there. And there are lots of instruments that are very inexpensive. If you log on to Amazon, or even if you go to certain music dealers and stores, you'll find all sorts of very cheap instruments that seem like really good deals. And so for parents who aren't familiar with what a quality violin is, they'll see what's called an outfit. So an instrument, a bow, a case, maybe some other supplies as well. And they'll think, $150 for all of that? That's a great deal. I'm going to buy it. But a lot of those are very low quality. This is definitely a situation where if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. And so this is where you as the teacher are going to want to help the parents to make sure the students get good quality instruments. These less expensive ones often have a lot of corners that have been cut when they were made. And sometimes we refer to them as violin-shaped objects or instrument-shaped objects, VSOs and ISOs. And when students have those, they often get very frustrated. They tend to be difficult to keep in tune because the pegs that hold the strings in tune haven't been properly fitted to the instruments, or other parts, they aren't shaped the right way, the bridge, so it's hard to stay on the right string that they want to play. So the students have a difficult time making a good sound, they have a difficult time playing in tune, and often that affects their sense of their own ability, when really it's the instrument that's causing the problem and not the student. So you'll see students become disinterested in playing the instrument simply because the instrument is low quality. So you want to provide parents with information. Some of what I've just told you now about how frustrated students will get with low quality instruments can help parents to realize this is something worth an investment. And another thing you can tell them is that lower quality instruments often require a lot of money to get them in a good playing condition. These cheap instruments, they come with low quality tailpieces and fine tuners, bridges that aren't shaped properly, pegs that aren't fit properly. So once you take those to a luthier or a music store of some kind to get it fixed, you're now spending a couple $100 more. So that instrument that seemed like a good deal is now just as expensive, if not more so, than if you had just spent a little more money in the first place. So you want to talk to parents about the kinds of wood they're looking for and advise them that they really want to try out the instrument if possible ahead of time. So getting their hands on it so that they can see the quality. Any instrument that's been painted like the ones I've shown you here, they tend to put very thick lacquer paint on these, and that affects how much sound comes out of the instrument. It affects the vibrations. So that's one thing to look for, the quality of the woods being used and the quality of the materials being used. Now, parents who don't know a lot, they will have a hard time judging that. If you're able to, I highly recommend suggesting retailers and brands that the parents can turn to get these instruments. If your students are going to be renting instruments, which certainly with the younger students, that's often a good route. They can rent an instrument in the size they need, and then as they grow, there will be trade-in options as they need new sizes. If parents are purchasing, That's usually better with older students who are getting full-size instruments. Either way, it's a good idea for you to size the student to see what size instrument they need, and then let the parents know so that when they go out to get an instrument, they already know what size they're looking for. Some stores, they might size the students, but they don't always do it correctly, or they'll figure out they need a certain size, but they don't have it in stock. So then they'll just give them the next closest thing. And that's not really a good idea, since it can lead to problems with tension and incorrect position. So it's good if you can tell the parents this is the size your student needs on this instrument. If you're able to suggest specific stores and brands, that's a good idea. I say if you're able because some school districts will not allow teachers to suggest one store versus another. If there are multiple music stores in your town, you might not be allowed to say, oh, I would suggest this one, but not that one. Same thing with other retailers that are online sources and things like that. So you want to check what you are allowed to do within your district. If you are able to suggest sources, get to know your local stores so that you know what kind of inventory they have, and so that you can help parents to go to the best store with the best options. National retailers such as Shar Music or Southwest Strings are really good sources. You can depend on them to provide quality instruments that have been set up well. So those are, if you can suggest those are great ones to send parents to. And then brands, this tends to be a brands to avoid. There are lots of great brands you can turn to, but there are certain cheaper quality ones that are better to avoid. So if you are able to give them a don't buy list, that's a good idea as well. And then another good route to go is to offer to evaluate anything the parents are considering. So in this circumstance, they might be wanting to buy something, and some retailers will let you get an instrument on a trial basis to try it out. And that's a way you can evaluate, or even if the parent just wants to send you a link to an instrument they're considering purchasing, this can be a way where you can weigh in without saying, oh, don't go to that store. Just if they're coming to you with an instrument they're considering, you can evaluate that instrument. It's always best when possible to have the student or the parents at least hold the instrument in their hands and get an idea of the quality before purchasing it. And if they can bring it in to you to truly evaluate, that's even better. Now, next, you might have a situation where the school is providing the instruments. If that's the case, you need to consider what age group you're dealing with and making sure you have an inventory of instrument sizes that's appropriate for that age group. Unlike in a band, for instance, where the instruments are the size that they are, in a string orchestra, we have different sizes based on size of the student. So for violins, you have 4/4, and then we go down in fractions all the way to little itty-bitty sizes for very young students. And the same thing with cellos. They're measured in fractions from 4/4 full size going down. Basses are also in fractions, but an important thing to remember is that the 3/4 bass is considered the full size. So if you are working with high schoolers and you want full size basses, you're going to want to get 3/4 size basses. 4/4s do exist. They're just very large and only used by professionals who know they're large enough to use that size instrument typically. Then for violas, remember that they are sized in inches. So you want to have a variety of sizes of inches that will be appropriate. For high school, you're looking in the 15-inch to 16.5-inch range, and typically violas are 1/2-inch sizes. If you're dealing with younger students, so elementary or middle school, you're going to need a wider variety of sizes. If you're teaching at a middle school, you could have students on full-size instruments, but also students on 3/4 and even half-size instruments. In an elementary school, you could be going down into quarter-size instruments potentially, depending on what age, what grade you have in the elementary school. So that's something to keep in mind, that you want to have the instruments available that you're most likely to use. Some schools will stock certain sizes, and then if they need something a little more unusual, they might rent it for the year or help that parent to acquire the necessary size. You also want to think about the budget for how you're going to maintain these instruments. If you're keeping them, if the school is going to own them, you're going to need to get repairs, even if they're well maintained. There's always repairs here and there. The bows will have to be rehaired occasionally. You will have, little bridges will warp and break over time, and just standard repairs happen, even if the students are taking care of the instruments. And unfortunately, sometimes bigger problems happen. Instruments are dropped or they're knocked into something. The weather changes and suddenly there's a crack in an instrument. A seam can pop open when the weather gets cold. So you want to know how you're going to fund repairs of that nature. You also want to think about, if you're providing them, are students going to be sharing instruments? Or are you going to have enough for every single student to have their own instrument? If they're sharing, are you going to have a schedule for when some students can take them home to practice? Are you going to have practice time before or after school when students can use them? So something to consider if there's a sharing situation. Also, are you going to charge a rental fee to the students to use the school instrument? This can be something that can help with that maintenance budget that you need to be covering. But it also, some schools don't allow you to charge rental fees for things like that. So you need to determine if that's possible in your school and how much you're going to charge. Will it cover your maintenance budget? And are parents able to pay it? Will you have scholarships available for students who can't pay the rental fee? And how will you handle a situation like that? Other things to consider with instruments. Low strings, because they're so large, cellos and basses, have some extra considerations. Sometimes, even if you're expecting parents to provide the instruments, you might still have an inventory of cellos and basses at your school so that students can leave one instrument at home to practice and have an instrument at school. This is also something where some schools will try to have enough instruments, if they're providing them, to have one that a student can leave at home. Perhaps for bass players, have an extra set, and then one at school. So something to consider there if you're able to help students in that way. This is going to increase their practicing if they're able to keep an instrument at home. It's a lot of work, especially if students are riding the bus, to get instruments that large back and forth between home and school. So if you are able to have a setup where one stays at home and one stays at school, that's a big help. The other to consider with instruments is the storage and logistics. If you are providing school instruments, you will need to consider storage for those. But even if students are providing them, you're going to need to think about where they put their instruments at the end of the day. It's generally not great to have students carrying their instruments from class to class all during the day. So you want a place for them to keep them. Certainly you can't expect cellists and bassists to lug their instruments between all of their other classes. So you need a space for that. And you also need to handle the logistics of when will they bring them to drop them off? How will they pick them up at the end of the day to take them home? And this can be challenging if you are an itinerant teacher who's moving between multiple schools. You might not be there at the beginning and the end of the day to handle those drop-offs and pickups. So you need to make arrangements for how that will work. The last thing we're going to discuss is other equipment that you need for an orchestra program. So there are big things you'll need. We'll get to funding at the end. Things like chairs and stands and racks for your chairs and stands, instrument storage, also music storage. You'll need stools potentially for your bassist if you want your bassist sitting. So those are some big ticket items that you'll need to figure out how to fund. Whether you're getting budget from your school district, maybe you're looking for grants or donations in the early days to start purchasing these big things. If you're in a school that already has some music programs, chairs and stands you might already have. You might have some of these racks. But if you're starting completely from scratch, you're going to need to get all of these things. Okay. Other things, accessories. You need rosin for the bows. You'll need replacement strings. Strings, they break or they just go bad over time. They wear out, they stretch. You'll need shoulder rests for your upper string students. You'll need rock stops or straps for the cellos and bassists. And these are things that you need to decide if, again, if the school will provide them or if the students will provide all of them. If the students are providing them, there are still going to be emergency situations. Strings might break during the school day and the student doesn't have an extra one with them. Students forget their rosin. So you want to have an emergency stock. And how is that being supplied? Does the district have money to pay for it? Or are you fundraising to do that? How does that work? Are you having students pay a sometimes called a fair share fee, where it's a small amount to cover incidental expenses like an extra string or some rosin here or there? That's something to check with your school to see if that's allowed. Some schools, students can be asked to purchase school supplies, but not to provide money for a fee like that. So if you aren't allowed to charge students, then you need to see if there's funding available or if students are just going to be on their own to supply all of these things, even in an emergency situation. You will also have curricular needs. You'll need method and technique books, and you'll need music. Method and technique books, this is another one where perhaps you're going to ask students to purchase their own personal method book so that they can keep it maybe for multiple years. Music tends to be something that the district is going to purchase. Again, you want to figure out your funding. These types of things can often be purchased with textbook money, so that can often be available if it's a curricular class. If it's an extracurricular activity, you need to see if you can charge parents. That might be part of the tuition. A little bit that's going to pay you as the instructor, and then part of the tuition goes to supplies like this. Fundraising can also be helpful for funding these extra expenses that a music program has, that an orchestra would cause. So you need to have a plan for how you're going to cover all of these different expenses. Hopefully that has given you some things to consider and some ideas about how to get started if you wanted to start a string program. Teaching strings is a very rewarding activity, so I hope you would consider it, whether you're hired to do it or if you walk into a situation as a band or choir director and think this is something missing from your school and want to start one to help out the students at that school. I hope you've learned something here, and if you ever have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'd be happy to help you.